You know, when I look up at the stars, I always get this feeling like, I don't know, like I'm just a tiny little speck in this giant universe.
Yeah.
Kind of humbling, right?
It is, yeah.
Well, today we're going to be exploring that feeling, but not just with the stars in the sky, but also with a chapter from the Quran called The Star.
Perfect choice. It really blends the celestial with the divine in a fascinating way.
Right. And you mentioned you wanted to learn more about Islamic beliefs, so this seemed like a good place to dive in.
Absolutely.
And of course, like all the chapters in the Quran, Muslims believe this one to be the word of God.
Right. Al-Hora revealed to the Prophet Muhammad.
Exactly. And it's really a message about a lot of things, like divine revelation, prophecy, the importance of rejecting false idols, seeking true guidance.
It covers a lot of ground.
Oh, and there's even a night journey mentioned, angels, a mysterious tree.
Don't forget the challenge about how we think of God.
Oh yeah, that too.
All connected by the image of a star.
Okay, color me intrigued. Let's get into it.
Well, the chapter opens with this. By the star as it goes down, your friend has not gone astray, nor has he erred.
Your friend, meaning the Prophet Muhammad.
That's right. And this is actually a reference to a really important event in Islamic tradition, the Prophet's night journey, known as the Isra and Miraj.
The Isra and Miraj.
Yeah.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't familiar, what exactly happened during this night journey?
Well, the belief is that the Prophet Muhammad was miraculously transported from Mecca to Jerusalem, and then he ascended through the heavens.
Whoa.
And he encountered other prophets and ultimately received revelation directly from God.
That's an incredible journey, and the star is invoked as like proof that this actually happened.
Right, like a cosmic witness.
The cosmic witness.
Verse 12 even challenges those who might doubt it. Will you dispute with him concerning what he saw?
So it's not just presented as a story, but as something that actually happened, that people can look to the sky and see this star and be like, oh, wow.
Yeah, exactly. It grounds it in something tangible, something everyone can see.
I can see how that would be powerful for believers.
Absolutely. And, you know, that emphasis on truthfulness is a recurring theme in the Quran.
Okay, so we've got this incredible journey, a star as a witness. What else does the chapter reveal?
Well, it goes on to talk about God's power and closeness.
Okay.
Verses 5 to 9 use really descriptive language, saying that the divine presence is within 2 bows length or closer.
Within 2 bows length or closer. That's an interesting image. I mean, it makes me think of God being both immense, but also incredibly close at the same time.
Yeah, it speaks to that duality, you know, God being both transcendent beyond our comprehension,
Right.
but also near to us, closer than we can even imagine.
It's kind of like how I feel when I think about, like, the universe as a whole, you know?
How so?
Well, we can study it and learn about these galaxies that are billions of light years away, but at the same time, we experience, you know, the effects of gravity every second holding us to the Earth.
Right.
It's this sense of something huge and personal all at once.
I love that analogy. It really captures that idea.
Okay, so we've got this amazing journey. We've got this image of God's closeness and power. Where does the chapter go from there?
Well, from there, it actually goes on to address a big issue of the time.
Yeah.
The worship of multiple gods, what's called polytheism.
Polytheism. Okay, in verses 19-23, call out some specific deities that were popular in pre-Islamic Arabia: Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat.
Yeah, these were goddesses that were worshipped at the time.
Right, and so just as a reminder for our listeners, polytheism means?
Polytheism is the belief in and worship of more than one god.
Right.
And the Quran is very clear that there's only one God, Allah. And associating any partners with him, especially the idea of assigning daughters to God while keeping sons for themselves, is just completely illogical and unacceptable.
Okay, so this chapter is directly challenging the beliefs of the people at the time.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Was that something that was common in the Quran?
Oh yeah, for sure. The Quran frequently engaged with the prevailing beliefs and practices of the time and offered a different way of looking at things.
It's like it's not just saying, hey, we have the right God, but it's making people think critically about why they believe what they believe.
You got it. And you see this in verse 23, where it says, they follow nothing but assumptions and what the ego desires, even though guidance has come to them from their Lord.
So it's saying desires and assumptions aren't enough. You need to actively seek guidance.
Exactly.
And I'm guessing that ties back to that main theme you mentioned earlier about rejecting false idols.
You got it.
Okay.
The Quran really consistently encourages critical thinking, not just accepting what you've been told.
Okay, so we've talked about the night journey, God's power and presence, this challenge to polytheism. Where do we go next?
Well, this leads us to another major theme in the chapter, which is human destiny.
Oh, human destiny.
Yeah, verses 24-25 ask these really interesting questions. Or is the human being to have whatever he desires? To Allah belong the last and the first. It's getting at the concept of divine decree, or qadar.
Qadar. That's a new word for me. What does that mean?
Yeah, it's a really important concept in Islam. It's the belief that God has complete knowledge of all things, the past, present, and the future.
So he knows everything.
He knows everything. He knows what choices we're going to make, what's going to happen in our lives, all of it.
So if God already knows everything, does that mean we don't really have free will? Like, is everything predetermined?
That's where it gets really complex.
Yeah.
And this is actually a topic that's been debated by Islamic scholars for centuries.
I bet.
Because Islam does emphasize that while God has knowledge of all possible outcomes, we still have the freedom to choose our actions, and we're responsible for those choices.
I see. So it's not about God, like, forcing us down a certain path, but more like he sees all the possible paths, knows which one we'll ultimately choose, but we're the ones doing the walking.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, that makes a little more sense.
It's about balancing divine knowledge with human agency, and that comes up again later in the chapter too.
Okay, cool. I'm excited to hear more about that.
Yeah. But before we move on, can I give you a quick real-life example of this qadar thing?
Oh, yeah, please, because that would be helpful.
Okay, so imagine you have a friend who's struggling with a big decision.
Okay.
Like maybe they're trying to decide whether to take a new job or stay in their current role.
Right. Been there.
And they come to you for advice.
Yeah.
And you listen to them, weigh the pros and cons, offer your perspective.
Yeah, I do that all the time.
But ultimately, the decision is theirs, right?
Of course.
They have the free will to choose what they think is best for them.
Totally. My advice isn't going to force their hand or anything.
Exactly. Now imagine that you're like a super perceptive friend. And based on their personality, their values, their past choices, you have a pretty good idea of which way they're going to lean.
Yeah, I feel like I have those friends, and I am that friend for some people too.
Right. But that doesn't mean you've taken away their free will. They're still the ones making the choice. You just happen to know them well enough to, like, anticipate their decision.
Okay, so God, having complete knowledge, is like that really perceptive friend.
Exactly.
He knows us better than we know ourselves and can foresee our choices, but we're still the ones actually making them.
You got it.
Okay, that's a really helpful analogy. So those choices matter, right?
Big time.
What else does the star tell us about that?
Well, verses 26-27 shift gears a bit, focusing on the afterlife, or what's known as the hereafter in Islam.
Hereafter, okay.
And these verses also introduce another key player in the Islamic worldview, which is angels.
Angels, okay.
Yeah, and in Islam, angels are seen as pure beings of light.
Okay.
Messengers of God who carry out his commands. And they're a really important part of the belief in the hereafter, which is...
Sorry to interrupt, but for our listeners who might not be familiar, what exactly is the hereafter?
Oh, good question. It's basically the Islamic belief in life after death.
Got it.
It's a fundamental principle in Islam. And these verses, they actually address a misconception that some people had at the time, which was assigning a female gender to angels.
It's interesting how the text, like, anticipates those misunderstandings and tries to correct them.
Oh, it does that a lot.
It's like, it's really trying to make sure that people are getting the message right.
Exactly. And it's not just clearing up confusion about angels. The mention of the hereafter also serves as this powerful reminder that our earthly life is temporary.
Right.
And our actions have consequences that go way beyond our time here.
So angels, the afterlife, consequences.
Yeah.
This chapter is covering a lot of ground.
Yeah, it really is.
What else should we know?
Well, things get pretty intense in verses 42-54.
Intense in a good way or a scary way?
I think more about the sheer scope of what's being talked about.
Okay.
These verses list all these different attributes and actions of God, like causing laughter and tears, giving life and death, creating male and female, enriching and impoverishing, even destroying past civilizations.
Yeah, that's a lot. What's the overall message there?
It's a powerful declaration of God's absolute power and sovereignty over everything, all aspects of creation. He's the ultimate source of everything.
So it's not just about angels and the afterlife. It's about recognizing that God's power is vast.
Exactly.
And it impacts literally every part of existence.
Exactly. And to really drive that point home, the chapter mentions the destruction of Ad and Thamud.
Who were Ad and Thamud?
They were two ancient Arab tribes that, according to Islamic tradition, were really powerful and advanced civilizations.
Okay.
But they rejected the prophet sent to them.
So they faced consequences.
And they ultimately faced divine consequences for those actions.
So it's like a cautionary tale. Don't think you're too big or too powerful to face consequences if you ignore, divine guidance.
Yeah, I think you could definitely see it that way.
Okay. Interesting.
It connects these big ideas about God's attributes to these real-world events.
Right.
Making the message much more tangible and, hard-hitting.
I'm seeing a pattern here. The chapter starts with a specific event, the prophet's journey, then it zooms out and explores these bigger ideas about God, human destiny, the consequences of our choices. Where does it go from there?
Well, it ends with a sense of urgency.
Okay.
A warning about something inevitable that's coming.
Ooh, a cliffhanger. Guess we'll have to wait for part 2 to find out what that is.
Well, no cliffhanger, really.
Yeah.
It all leads to the day of judgment.
Okay.
Verses 56-61 warn about its coming, and they even kind of question those who are indifferent or even mock the idea.
Oh, the Day of Judgment. Yeah, that's a big concept in a lot of religions.
It is.
What makes it unique in Islam?
Well, like the hereafter, the Day of Judgment is a core principle in Islam.
Okay.
It's the day when every action, every thought, even your intentions are judged by God, and everyone receives either the reward or punishment.
Okay, but if God already knows everything that we're going to do, like we talked about with Qadar, why even have a judgment?
That's a great question.
I mean, isn't the outcome already decided?
Yeah, and that gets to the heart of how Islam views justice and accountability.
Okay.
Think about it this way. Just because a judge knows a defendant is guilty, it doesn't mean they skip the trial, right?
Right.
The trial is where the evidence is presented, motives are examined, and ultimately justice is served publicly.
So the Day of Judgment is less about God needing to figure things out and more about making things clear for everyone to see.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging the weight of our choices,
Right.
the impact they have on ourselves and others, and facing the consequences,
Yeah.
good or bad, in a way that's fair and transparent.
Okay, that makes sense. It's not just about arbitrary punishment, but a reckoning based on how we actually lived our lives.
Exactly.
Does the chapter actually say anything about what that judgment's going to look like?
Not in detail, no.
Okay.
It keeps it pretty mysterious, actually, it says. The inevitable is imminent. None besides Allah can unveil it.
Ooh, okay.
So that leaves room for interpretation and reflection, and I think that's intentional. It's more about instilling that sense of awareness and accountability
Right.
than actually giving you a step-by-step of what to expect.
I can see that. The unknown can be a pretty powerful motivator.
For sure.
So we've got this night journey, this deep dive into God's power and closeness, this rejection of false idols, the idea of divine decree and human responsibility, and then this, looming day of judgment. It's a lot.
It's a lot to unpack, for sure.
It is. And this is just one chapter out of how many in the Quran?
This is just one out of 114.
Wow.
And each chapter offers its own unique insights and perspectives.
Okay, so zooming out a bit, does the star give us a good overall sense of the core principles of Islam?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
That emphasis on divine revelation, the rejection of false gods, the belief in the hereafter and the Day of Judgment, these are all fundamental to Islamic beliefs.
What I find really interesting is how all these concepts are presented. It's not just dry theological pronouncements.
Right.
It's really vivid, almost poetic.
It is, and that's one of the things that makes the Quran so captivating.
Yeah.
It speaks to the heart as much as to the mind. Think back to that image of the divine presence being within 2 bows length or closer. That's not just some abstract theological idea. It's an invitation to actually experience the awe and intimacy of being close to God.
Right. It's God's power is unfathomable, but his presence is something we can actually feel and connect with.
Exactly. And that interplay between the vastness of the divine and the personal experience of faith is woven all throughout the Quran.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the Quran was engaging with the beliefs and practices of the time it was revealed.
Yeah.
Can you give me a little more context on that? What was going on in Arabia at that time?
Yeah, so pre-Islamic Arabia was a pretty diverse place religiously.
Yeah.
You had polytheism,
Right.
where people worshipped a whole pantheon of gods and goddesses, like the ones mentioned in this chapter. Covered Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat.
Right.
There was also some presence of Judaism and Christianity, along with a mix of indigenous Arabian beliefs.
So it was a real melting pot of faiths.
Exactly, it was. And that's important to remember when you're reading the Quran.
Okay.
It wasn't just speaking into a void, it was responding to challenging and sometimes even absorbing elements from the existing religious landscape.
So when the Quran emphasizes the oneness of God, it's directly pushing back against that polytheistic worldview.
Exactly.
It's not just about who the right God is, but about a fundamentally different way of understanding the divine.
You got it. And that challenge to the status quo, both religiously and socially, wasn't without consequences.
Right, I imagine.
The Prophet Muhammad and his early followers faced serious opposition, persecution, even violence.
Yeah, I can imagine when you're shaking things up that much, you're bound to make some enemies along the way.
Oh, for sure. But despite all of that, the message of the Quran spread rapidly, transforming the Arabian Peninsula and ultimately shaping a major world religion.
It's pretty mind-blowing to think about how those events, those challenges, those revelations are still echoing through history today.
It really is. Okay,
so we've covered a lot of historical and theological ground here, but what about the personal implications? Like, how does all this connect to someone living in the 21st century? How does it inform how I live my life?
That's the big question, right?
It is.
And it's one that each individual has to wrestle with for themselves.
Right.
But I think there are some universal themes in this chapter that transcend time and culture.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, take the idea of rejecting false idols, for instance.
Okay.
It's not just about literal statues or deities.
Yeah.
It's about questioning anything that we place too much importance on in our lives.
Okay.
Anything that controls our lives or distracts us from what truly matters.
So it could be wealth, status, obsession with social media, even addiction to work.
All of that, yep.
Okay.
Anything that becomes a substitute for genuine connection, for meaning, for purpose, for something bigger than ourselves.
Right. So it's not about giving up everything good in life,
right,
but about taking a look at our priorities, making sure they're actually aligned with our values.
Exactly. And another theme that I think resonates strongly is this idea of the Day of Judgment.
Okay.
It's easy to dismiss it as some far-off event.
Right.
But what if we thought about it as an opportunity for accountability and growth? A reminder that our actions have consequences, that we're responsible for the choices we make, and that ultimately we'll be held accountable for how we lived our lives.
That's a really different way of looking at it.
It is.
It's not about living in fear of punishment, but about living intentionally.
Yes.
Recognizing that our choices really do matter, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us.
Exactly. And that's a message that I think transcends any religious background or belief system.
Okay, cool.
It's just a fundamental part of being human.
Now, one thing I've been thinking about throughout this whole conversation is that concept of divine decree, qadar.
Yeah.
It's tough, right? How do we reconcile the idea that God knows everything with our own free will and responsibility?
It's a head-scratcher for sure.
It is.
One of the most debated topics in Islamic theology.
I bet.
And there's not really an easy answer, but maybe it's less about finding a definitive solution and more about recognizing the paradox.
God, paradox. What do you mean?
It's like holding these two seemingly contradictory truths at the same time.
Okay.
On the one hand, we have God's absolute knowledge and power. He knows everything that's going to happen, every choice we'll make.
But on the other hand,
we have our own free will, our ability to choose, to act, to really shape our own destinies.
So it's not an either but a both hand situation.
Exactly. And that's a really hard concept for us as humans to grasp because we like things to be clear-cut,
right,
easily categorized. But maybe that's part of the beauty of faith. Embracing that mystery, trusting in something bigger than ourselves, even when we don't fully understand it.
It's kind of like trying to wrap your head around the concept of infinity. You can conceptualize it, but you can never fully grasp it.
Perfect analogy.
And that tension between our limited understanding and the vastness of the divine is something that comes up again and again in the Quran, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's about acknowledging our limitations, but also recognizing our potential to grow and to understand more.
Exactly.
So it's okay to not have all the answers.
Of course.
To wrestle with these big questions.
Absolutely. In fact, that wrestling, that questioning, that searching, that's all part of the journey.
Okay.
That's what keeps us engaged, keeps us seeking, keeps us growing.
Maybe the journey itself is even more important than arriving at a definite answer.
Now you're getting it.
Yeah.
That's a really important point. The star raises these profound questions about God, about the meaning of life, about our purpose.
Right.
But it doesn't necessarily lay out all the answers.
It's more like it gives us a guidebook,
right,
points us in a direction and says, go explore.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's an invitation to embark on your own journey of discovery, a lifelong pursuit of knowledge and understanding and spiritual growth, And that journey is unique to each individual.
So there's no one-size-fits-all approach to faith.
Exactly.
Okay.
What resonates with one person might not resonate with another, and that's okay.
Right.
The key is to keep searching, to keep questioning, to keep seeking that which brings meaning and purpose to your life.
Like we're all given a map, but we get to choose our own path, our own adventure.
I love that.
Yeah.
The journey is just as important as the destination, maybe even more so.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. Divine revelation, rejecting false idols, the day of judgment, Qadar, the implications of these beliefs for us personally. I'm starting to feel like I need a bigger notebook.
I hear you. It's a lot to take in, but I think the key takeaway is that the Quran, even in just one chapter, like the star, offers such a rich and multifaceted perspective on life and faith and the human condition.
Yeah.
It's a text that's still challenging and inspiring and provoking thought, even centuries after it was revealed.
It's like a bottomless well of wisdom. You can keep dipping into it and always come up with something new to think about, something to challenge your assumptions.
Absolutely, and that's what makes it such a valuable resource. Whether you're a scholar, a newcomer to Islam, or just someone seeking meaning and a deeper connection to something greater than yourself.
I have a feeling our listener is going to be doing a lot of thinking and exploring after this deep dive.
I hope so, because ultimately it's not just about acquiring knowledge, but about allowing that knowledge to transform us, to reshape our understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
It's about taking these ancient wisdom teachings and finding ways to apply them to our modern lives.
Exactly, and that's a journey worth taking.
You know, it's funny. We started talking about stars, like the ones in the sky,
Right.
giant balls of gas, light years away.
Yeah.
But this chapter, the star, it's really brought things down to earth, you know?
It has.
It's about us,
Yeah.
about how we live our lives, the choices we make, the things we value.
That's the power of these kinds of texts, you know?
Yeah.
Connecting the cosmic with the personal.
Totally. It's like the chapter saying, hey, marvel at the universe, but don't forget you're making an impact right here, right now.
It's a call to action, to live with intention,
Right.
to align your actions with your beliefs.
And to remember that even our small choices, they can make a difference.
Oh, absolutely. Way beyond what we might realize.
Like that butterfly effect.
Exactly.
One tiny wing flap can set off a whole chain of events.
And our actions, even the ones that seem insignificant, can have these unintended consequences.
Yeah.
So it's important to act with compassion and wisdom.
And the star gives us some good guidance on how to do that, right?
It does. It's full of wisdom.
So if our listener wants to explore more Islamic beliefs, what would you recommend? What should they check out next?
Well, there are so many great resources out there.
Yeah.
You could start by exploring some of the shorter chapters in the Quran,
Okay.
like the Sincerity or the Daybreak.
I've heard of those.
Yeah, they're both pretty short and offer these profound reflections on God and faith and, you know, what it means to be human.
And I'm guessing there are tons of translations and commentaries available.
Oh yeah, tons. A wealth of information.
Okay.
And I always encourage people to seek out multiple perspectives, you know?
Right.
Different interpretations from different scholars and schools of thought. It enriches the whole learning process.
It's like having a conversation with a bunch of really wise friends.
Yeah.
You might not agree with everything they say,
Right.
but you're bound to learn something new. Expand your understanding.
Exactly. You know, engaging with these kinds of texts, it should be a dynamic process.
Right.
Full of questions and reflections and new insights.
Okay, I think we've given our listener a lot to think about today.
We have.
We've explored some pretty big ideas. Revelation, prophecy, idolatry, destiny, judgment. Phew.
It's been quite a journey.
It has been. And I hope this deep dive has made our listeners curious, you know,
I hope so too.
and inspired them to keep exploring Islamic beliefs and the wisdom that this tradition has to offer.
Absolutely.
So speaking of inspiration, I think it's time for our final thought-provoking question.
I love these.
And this one's for you, dear listener. The star really emphasized how we're all accountable for our actions.
It did.
So think about this. If you knew for certain that you were going to be judged based on how you live your life, what would you change? What would you do differently starting today? It's a big question, but I think those are the kinds of questions that can lead to the most meaningful shifts in our lives.
Couldn't agree more.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone.
And until next time, keep seeking and keep questioning and never stop reaching for the stars.